This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with John Kunemund of Alexander Gray Associates about the gallery's recent exhibit, Conjuring Tenderness, Paintings from 1987, which featured the work of the late artist Hugh Steers. Known for his evocative and deeply personal works, Steers' paintings capture moments of vulnerability and intimacy, often set against the backdrop of the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. In the conversation, we explore the context of Steers' work, his unique artistic vision, and his work's continued ability to resonate with contemporary audiences. And now, a conversation about the enduring tenderness of Hugh Steers with John Kunemund. John Kunemund, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. John, you're with Alex Gray and Associates. I wanted to talk to you about an exhibit that you guys have going on now through August 9th, an exhibit of the work of Hugh Steers, an exhibition titled Conjuring Tenderness, Paintings from 1987 at your guys' location at 384 Broadway in New York. John, like I was mentioning to you earlier, the life and work of Hugh Steers wasn't exactly something that I was really privy to and before preparing for a conversation with you. And like we were discussing earlier, sometimes that happens, but it doesn't mean that it's not the time for a re-examination, a revitalization, a glorifying of someone's work. Somebody who, in this case, passed more than 30 years ago. For those who don't know of Hugh Steers, where do you start to explain to them who he was and the context of the body of work that he was producing?
Thank you for having me. I'm very delighted to talk about Hugh Steers with you. To summarize Hugh Steers is a challenge. I think he was a very complex individual and a very talented painter, but as a young artist was one who was incredibly committed to figuration and painting in a style in which he loved and revered. And so I think looking at kind of his body of work, he's a storyteller and someone who depicted the world in which he was living in, grappling with, dreaming of, and escaping from, and doing that through a style of painting out at a very young age. I think one of the things we have to contextualize anytime we look at a painting by Hugh Steers is that beyond just looking at the talent of his paintings in themselves, the body of work is roughly 8 years long from the ages of 25 to 32. So we're dealing with a very young, talented, gifted artist who's contending with a very complicated world.
So biographically, winds up going to Yale, Skowhegan, but that figurative narrative work is kind of driven by his sexual identity.
Yeah, I mean, he, as a young man, he grew up in Washington, D.C., kind of related to a larger political family. His stepfather was a Republican congressman. His mother is in the Alconclass family, so was a bridesmaid at Jackie O and John F. Kennedy's wedding. So there's a lot of sort of storied history just tied within his own family dynamic. His great uncle was Gore Vidal, for instance. So a lot of complexities between both the cultural world and the political world in which he grew up, all of which contending with a sexuality that was very much frowned upon by his kind of more conservative family. And grappling with that in his youth. He was able to kind of escape that in a way. He attended Hotchkiss for high school and then went to Yale, where, from what I've gathered, he was not shy about his sexuality. He was very out. He was very charming, outgoing, kind to everybody, and really took a lot of kind of younger, shyer people under his wing. But in that way, his entire body of work is looked through the lens of his identity as a gay man. and representing that in a tile at a time and in a style of paintings which that was not very visible.
So, we were talking about that body of work mainly being from like age 25 to 32. What years are we talking about there?
Yeah, so I would say the first kind of mature paintings, where he had a real sense of style and purpose and subject matter for which we've come to know him, began in 1987, and he passes away in early 1995. So the last painting on canvas was 1994. He graduated from Yale in 1985.
When we look at his work, it's really interesting because when I look at the work, it's figurative. They're dark interiors, a lot of chiaroscuro, these moody scenes. The interesting thing is like my art history brain points to folks like Edward Hopper, who would often have people alone in those sort of settings together. I mean, there are people together, but they're not necessarily connecting. And I feel like we see some of that in this exhibit. I also see some hints of like Eric Fischl or, even like Depression era figurative work like Thomas Hart Benton, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of stuff going on.
Yes. Yeah. I think, Hugh was a avid study of art history, um, and kind of all things. I mean, there's a lot of allegory into these paintings. There's Christian iconography, there's the Greek classics as an iconography. The Pietà appears often in the work. There's references to Caravaggio, Van Dyck, Bonnard, Vuillard, uh, and and also, I mean, we see in a lot of these paintings in the show, specifically this figure of the cat that appears, and there's many reasons for that. Black cats as omens of kind of bad signs or death or kind of
Right.
ominous environments or ominous futures. But also, you see a lot of those paintings in Baltus, or a lot of cats
Right.
in Baltus paintings. So he's pulling from a lot of different sources.
Yeah.
And I think in a contemporary sense, yeah, you can look at artists like Fischl, Sally, who were doing kind of more figurative work from their lives, maybe not necessarily as fraught as the lives in which Hugh was painting. But definitely those connections are there. But with his contemporaries, he was one of the few painters painting figuratively and painting from his life and the figure representing his life. Um, and then one other point that you brought up about Hopper is someone that he referenced frequently. And I think, for me and my perspective of the lineage of like a Hopper painting and a Hugh Steers painting is kind of from Hopper, you're looking at the outside in.
Right.
You're a voyeur kind of across the street in another building from a point of a distance from the figure. In Hugh's work, you're in their world completely. Um, and even the way that he's creating kind of these odd sources of light or perspectives, you'll look at one figure and you're kind of right in front of them, and a figure in the background, you're kind of somehow warped above them. And then the floors kind of are warped also in a way that takes you right back into the center of the paintings, so just kind of this very sophisticated style of thinking of his compositions. But in all senses, you're in the painting with these people.
The way you describe that, it makes me think of a specific painting from this exhibit of a person undressing next to a bathtub, and the whole structure of it is all bending and twisting. And it reminds me of a huge Bonnard retrospective that I went to last year, where he had a whole series of bathroom paintings. And I remember they're also being really odd warping perspectives. And we never have enough room in a bathroom to really set up some sort of perspective, right? I mean, it's all pretty cramped, right?
Well, especially in New York, right?
You mentioned the sense, like with the Hopper work, it's almost like we're viewing from the outside. It makes me think of the word voyeurism. As we're in these scenes, are we a welcome bystander? Are we a witness in the space? Or are we a voyeur? What is your sense?
I think it changes based on the picture. But I think from Hugh's perspective, it's both. Also, I think, we talk about his, when I talk to people about him and his personality, I mean, he was a very complicated person, very sardonic, very witty, but also very defiant. He's kind, he's jovial, laughs in the face of death, but also is, obviously uh, kind of eating at him. And there's a lot of anger and pain that comes with that. But looking at the paintings themselves with that kind of idea and sort of this understanding of who he was, I think there are paintings that are really romantic, where you are sort of welcome in the scene, and that there are paintings that are more defiantly political, where he's confronting you. And then I also think about the audience that he's making these paintings for. There are two very specific audiences, neither of which were quite open to the paintings. You have the kind of the queer community, the gay artists of the time who were grappling with kind of identity politics and what that meant in the larger art world and what that meant for art making. And certainly that wasn't painting. It was photography, it was film, performance, documentation, conceptual based work. And then you have a more conservative traditional audience, mostly straight people who are turning a blind eye to the AIDS crisis, who he's confronting with this subject matter. And so, kind of an oft repeated quote when we write about Hugh Steers or talk about Hugh Steers, this idea that he wants to lure people in with a recognizable style, but confront them with the subject matter of a challenging nature. And so that's getting at both of them. He wants you to be in the scene, but then he wants you to recoil and kind of feel like you're not welcome at the same time. I think that's something he captures really beautifully in his work.
It's not overtly political. I mean, I've seen some pieces that there was more allegory that seemed to be speaking with more of a big stick than subtle nuances. But the majority of his work, it's less political, but trying to reach people on a human level, maybe try to humanize the epidemic that he was seeing around him.
I think that's it. I mean, I don't think he certainly didn't want to be known as an AIDS artist. I think there are moments in his life where the illness was taking over, particularly in the later work, starting kind of around 1992 to 1994. You see really overt political paintings. There are American flags draping over kind of naked bodies that are contorted, and there are images in hospital scenes. There are images of pill bottles, and also kind of defiant paintings about gender expression. But in these earlier works, and particularly in the 1987 paintings, they're much more open-ended and nuanced in terms of the subject matter. And I think in any sense, you can't divorce a painting or an artwork from the time in which it's made. So I think if you know about what was happening in the 1980s and in New York, you can see that in the paintings. If you have no idea about that history and you just are not approaching it, you're just in a gallery, you're in a museum, and you see one of Hugh's paintings and you don't read the wall label or the press release, there's a lot more that you can take in without needing to know the time period. And you can just kind of sense the emotional, prosaic, intriguing, and mysterious quality to the paintings. And that was something he was really interested in, was having people bring themselves to every work. So he painted them from his perspective, from all of the needs that he had as an artist and as a person and his emotional states. But he didn't want to put that on the audience. And so that's, I think, what you see particularly in the works from 1987.
I think there's also a sense that there's nothing graphically sexual. If he's welcoming in a conservative heterosexual audience, he's reaching them in a way that he's portraying these relationships in the most tender, human sort of way that they're bound to resonate with on a human level.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think. That's what I've always seen in them, and what kind of always drew me to them, just as the images themselves.
Last year, I had a curator on who had put together a huge retrospective of Keith Haring work. And in the course of the conversation, we were looking at some of Keith Haring's quotes from his life. And very early on, before he even started his career, he had this preconception that he was going to die early for some reason. And it was just manic about being as prolific as possible. Do we see any of the context of this time and the epidemic driving the work, not just in terms of of content, but just in terms of I know my days are probably numbered, so I need to leave my mark in terms of scale in the days that I have.
Absolutely. I think a word that comes up frequently with Hugh's peers that are still alive is that there was kind of a intensity and a tenacity to his practice, both about being shown and having the work be visible, but in the physical making of the work. Um, Often people are like, he was constantly in the studio, he was constantly working. Anytime he went to his apartment, there would be paintings and canvases and paper everywhere with works in progress. And you see that over the course of 8 years. It's not a large body of work because of the truncated time period, but he was very prolific. I mean, there are hundreds of paintings. I don't have an exact number, but certainly a significant amount of work was produced in that short period of time. And I think it was because of the same perspective. When he was diagnosed, it was pretty advanced. So I don't think he had any sort of ideation that he would survive it. He might have, but certainly in his perspective of it, when the diagnosis came, that was the death sentence. And you think about the 80, I mean, of course it was. I don't think how you can get that out of your mind. So contending with this kind of insane load to bear psychologically, I think the only place he could really think to put it was in the work and creating the paintings. So there was, a real intensity and a real drive and passion to produce consistently and constantly.
So that this current show, Conjuring Tenderness, paintings from 1987, what was the process like for pulling this work together? I mean, was it simply looking at that time period, or did you want to craft a particular narrative around a particular subset of these images? What did the curation of this show look like?
For me, this was a show I've always wanted to do. I've been with the gallery and working with the estate of Hugh Steers for 11 years now. We've made 5 shows over the course of our representation of Hugh's work. Actually, my first show when I started the gallery as a gallery assistant was the first gallery show with Hugh Steers, which was focused primarily on scenes in bathrooms. And from that point on, every show has kind of been more about kind of an overarching theme or subject matter, whether it's his paintings in nature and the use of natural light, whether it's, a show. The first show I made at the gallery was called Nullities of Life, which was an exhibition in 2018 that focused on kind of the more mundane daily aspects of our existence and painting them and rendering them beautifully, and how we can elevate those daily parts of our lives that seem regular and normal, but through painting and through style and through his kind of perspective were elevated. And that was the first show that I felt like dealt with the more poetic nature of the work. And that's always been my particular interest. I think the subject matter is something you can always grab onto and talk about. And I love talking about that and contextualizing it. But I really just am drawn to the more romantic, poetic aspects of the work, the more open-ended nature of the paintings. And then 1987 is the year that kind of started what we know Hugh for in terms of these couples in spaces caring for each other, whether it's in bed or sitting up in chairs or dealing in showers and kitchens. And I thought that was very interesting to me. I think to take a step back from kind of the work that people know, which is mostly late career, in quotes, 90s paintings, and look back at where it started. And kind of as we've steadily been building visibility for his practice and crafting narrative and crafting context, and building visibility, I thought it was, with this show, really important for our 5th show and our first in our new space in Tribeca to open it with these early paintings that kind of start the dialogue of everything else that we've been doing. And the first show that we've done that is focused on a specific body of work, I think that was also very exciting to me. Kind of almost like working with a living artist when they produce a body of work in studio over the course of a year. Those are the exhibitions we make. When you're working with an estate, you can pull from lots of different sources and draw these different through lines through a practice. But for it was really exciting to almost treat this like kind of like the perennial emerging artist that Hugh Steers is, and to present one of his first bodies of work.
No, that's really a romantic notion that these paintings are all siblings that could quite possibly have all been hanging around the same studio at the same time being worked on, right? And so it's kind of a snapshot of what his perspective would have been at that time.
Absolutely. And, yeah, for me, that was just personally very satisfying.
Sure.
Uh, and, the last time a lot of these paintings or any paintings from this period would have been shown was in 2000 with an exhibition that Richard Anderson did, focused on Hugh's early works. And Richard Anderson was Hugh Steers' gallerist in the 90s and gave Hugh a solo show every year, which is also pretty remarkable. And so, yeah, I kind of wanted to just pretend like it was a moment where Hugh would have been talking with his dealer.
You've been working with Hugh as a subject for your work for a decade. What sort of feedback do you get from contemporary artists that come to the shows that view Hugh's work? Do they find inspiration? Do they find connection with him as a person, being at a similar point in their careers? Do they find connection with the content, the context? What do you hear from artists that come and view Hugh's work?
Yeah, the short answer was your questions were yes and yes. I feel like we're being very overly positive in general in talking about Hugh, but the response generally has been positive, and that's shifted. I think when I first started at the gallery, or first started working with Hugh's material, the audience was by and large his peer group. And that was really tough. I think there's a healthy respect for the work, but also a desire to keep distance from that time period. A lot of emotions, a lot of tears, as you can expect. I think, kind of it opens the floodgates literally of thinking about Hugh and then all of their friends, the people, the community that was lost. And so we talked a lot about that time period with the audience. We talked about survivor guilt with people. But just in terms of thinking about the painting, I also talk about kind of how they first saw Hugh's work in the 80s and 90s and how kind of really against it they were, which is a position I still am contending with because I see it in this moment and in the moment that I'm living, in the moment in this contemporary art world that I'm experiencing, that it's hard to look back and think there's a time period where people weren't responding to figurative or narrative painting. And so it's really interesting to engage with people in that way. I think over the last 5 years or so, the audience has really been building in terms of younger generations of art lovers and artists. And I think, I still haven't found the right word. I talk about like reverence a lot for the AIDS crisis or for artists or people that lived through it. I think it's a respect, an appreciation, I don't know, just an immense amount of love that we kind of we care for and want to nurture this history. And I think in that way, there's a large appreciation for the narrative work that exists in this moment that needed to be made in that moment, and that Hugh left a legacy for people to engage with that's so visually clear and beautiful, but kind of tragic. And there's so much to glean from. So I think there are younger generations of artists who kind of wowed and floored by the fact that he was making this work. And whether they knew it or not, or know it or not, there's a deep connection in what they're making and what Hugh was doing. And I think you kind of see that passing of the torch from one generation to the next in terms of defiance. So I think, you brought up earlier, you don't see these really sexual images. They're very tender, they're caressing, they're holding, they're touching shoulders, they're touching hands. And now you see artists like Lou Fertino or Duran Langberg, to name two, who are kind of, I want to say like hypersexualized, but are really looking at queer identity through the lens of sexuality. And even on younger artists like Anthony Coudet and Justin Liam O'Brien, who reference Hugh in their works, and create these dreamlike tableaus that are kind of based in reality but divorced as well from the day to day, our day to day existence. I think you see a lot of that, and I don't know if that work could be existed or celebrated without artists like Hugh.
You mentioned there had the reception of his work then. Fad and fashion
Mm-hmm.
it just kind of swings back and forth. When we look at Hugh's work today, I think our 2024 sensibilities feels like this is somebody whose work we could be seeing rolling up a garage door in Brooklyn. Along with his peers, how did it stand out? Was it a time of abstraction and people were pushing against figuration? How did it fit within the context visually of those years that he was making work?
It really stood out. I mean, there wasn't a lot of painting at that time, or at least in terms of the celebrated high art world, what was invisible in museums and being championed by curators and galleries. I'm going to say that there's certainly painters existing throughout the world at that period, but in terms of what was really being championed in culture, painting was really looked down on. I mean, it was the time period of painting is dead. I think Hugh's work is why painting never will be dead, because we're so attracted just to the surface of paint in general. And I think you can just get so much more emotional upliftment and enlightenment out of paintings than, say, photography or something that kind of is a quick image versus something that you can sit with for a long period of time. But yeah, I think it really, really stood out. There was not anyone else in New York with the same level of visibility as Hugh Steers making impressionist like paintings. And so I think he found a lot of criticism at that time period, mostly as not for his talent, I think, and even in talking to contemporary artists today and artists kind of in their 50s and 60s who saw the work contemporaneously, all recognized that he was a very skilled painter, but they were sort of mad at him for painting and doing something heteronormative or something traditional and conservative rather than pushing the envelope of an art making practice. Some of those artists back then are now painting. They just weren't painting then. And I think Hugh was the one that had the real commitment and the sort of fervor to not say, well, I can't paint because I'm not supposed to be painting. So let me find something else to do. He was like, I will be painting. I am a painter. This is my identity. This is the work I want to make. I don't care if there's a market for it. Um, and those, I think, are the things that tend to last the longest, is when there is such a direct point of view. And some of those same artists also come into the gallery and look at the paintings now and say, gosh, he was smarter than all of us. He's left the legacy. He's left the story. He's given, I don't know, our our history to in a very generous way.
Right.
And I think we can look at a number of other queer artists of the period who are incredible art. I mean, I'm not going to say, I mean, well, Felix Gonzalez Torres, I think,
Right.
stands above many of that period as a pivotal voice. But I think that you need to understand conceptual art. You have to understand and read uh, and be kind of in this art world, or be an art historian to really connect with it. And I think there's a beautiful emotional quality to his work once you understand what taking the piece of candy away from that pile means. And I think that's something incredibly beautiful. I think he was much more generous in terms of his imagery and in terms of his painting style, and to a wider audience that now can appreciate it.
Are there specific pieces in this current exhibition that you find especially moving or significant?
That's a tough question. I think I can spend a lot of time talking about each of them, but I will not. I mean, I think certainly a masterpiece in the show is Dropping In. It's kind of the main image when you walk into the gallery space. It has the biggest distance. And it's just a really beautiful, nuanced painting of a man laying naked in bed and his lover, friend, again, not didactic. There's no way of knowing if even if this other figure is coming or going.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's rendered in such a beautiful palette and in such a kind of subtle and romantic way with the drapery that's hidden behind the bed and the way that it folds into the sheets and the blanket and how that kind of creates the sheath of the figure. I think it's just such a classically beautiful painting. I think in terms of outside of that, in terms of subject matter, the painting called Wicker Chair, I think is probably one of the most devastating paintings in the show. It's actually interesting. It took me a while from looking at it to notice that the one of the figures is holding a knife while the other person is kissing his wrist. I thought it was kind of just like this loving moment. You kiss someone on their hand, on their arm, sort of in this just very charming, sweet, romantic moment. Um, and then when we pulled paintings out when I was curating this exhibition, I always knew he was holding something, but I'd been looking at images. And so to see it in the painting in the flesh and see that it's a blade really brought a whole new meaning to the painting. And again, you don't know if it's a before or an after of this act of self-harm. But it's this kind of devastatingly beautiful painting that kind of keeps drawing me in to get into a sense of place that he was feeling, who these subjects that he was dreaming up were feeling. And then you have this kind of incredibly painted rug and drape. I mean, if I was doing another exhibition about Hugh Steers, it'd be called like Carpets and Drapes. It's the way he paints them, and these patterns are so beautiful.
Which again sounds like Villard, right? I mean, it's
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think he was. I mean, this is sort of the when it gets to like the cheekier, interesting side of Hugh's personality is painting these very barren apartments in these very dramatic Baroque fabrics, really elevating the existence of these figures in these sort of bleak East Village tenement apartments with this sense of high drama and European royalty and these other sort of signifiers that really sort of elevates their life and the way that they're represented. So you see that in this painting, and also you have this cat sort of precariously perched on the top of the title of the painting, the wicker chair, that's draped in this beautiful warm light. So you have this black cat that's ominous, but also painted so tenderly and warmly over this kind of looking over this kind of scene of tragedy and romance.
well, it took me 7 or 8 different examinations of the painting dropping in before I realized that the one figure on the bed was actually interacting with the cat, which I guess the way it was emerging out of the shadows, my mind wasn't even registering that. I thought it was just like a shadow of the pillow, but
Mm.
which reminds me of, there's this Picasso piece of the three musicians, and underneath them, if you look closely, rather abstractly, is this black dog, right? I don't know how much he talked about it or how much we can just make assumptions, but are we to assume that it's at the surface level just a lovely rendering of his cat? Or is it an allegory for like the specter of death that's always just kind of tiptoeing around the room?
Yes, and yes. I think that everything with Hugh Steers, I think as people, as humans, we look for patterns, we look for story, we look for clues, and so we bring whatever we want to the paintings, and that was so fascinating to Hugh. And I think that when it comes to the allegories or the metaphors, uh, they cover the gamut in terms of sources of inspiration and desires on his part to express those. So I think, we see the black cat, we're like, oh, we got it. It's death. Um, but I think for the cat, it's also, they're playful. They are a bit mischievous. So I think there's that side of his personality that creeps into the painting with these animals. Um, they, I think going back to what you said earlier, they're a bit of the voyeur in the paintings. They're the ones witnessing. So they could be a stand-in for the viewer. They certainly were a stand-in for his roommate. She had a cat that was in their apartment. Hugh did not love this cat. And so I think he got some of his anger or anxiety around being around this animal that he couldn't control, that kind of had its own sense of space within his territory and his studio, because the studio, for the most part, was his apartment, was just another way of depicting that. And I was talking to one of Hugh's friends that knew both of them very well. And he was like, he would talk about how she was kind of always around. This roommate was always around, and they loved each other. They went together. It was a great relationship. But I think the cat was also her stand-in. So I think it's a loving depiction of someone in his life that maybe was it's an annoying depiction of an animal in his life. And it can mean so much in the history of art and how cats have been represented in culture.
Right. Is it a comfort that thing is always around, or is it an annoyance that thing is always around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes and yes.
It doesn't sound like this is going to be the last Hugh Steers exhibit that you work on there at Alexander Gray. Do you have any ideas on what the next collection will be built around? Have you allowed yourself to start thinking that far ahead?
Not really. I think with some of this, there's strategy and the dynamics of building a legacy that are always at the forefront. And so with that, it's always kind of context and museums particularly. And so that's something that's definitely top of mind, and engaging with museums either on exhibition or acquisition. We've had some success in that place, mostly in Europe, actually, is where most of the visibility for the work has been in the last few years. And I don't know if that's just because of an appreciation for painting style or an openness to talk about some of the qualities of Hugh's work that maybe are more fraught in the United States. But certainly, we're working towards a major museum show, and in the hopes that that's the next major visible moment of Hugh's work, is something more comprehensive and more forward with the public. I think at the gallery, I'll be dreaming of the next show every day until we have the next show. And I'll come up with something, but I'm excited about it.
The show is Hugh Steers' Conjuring Tenderness, paintings from 1987. John Kunemund, thank you so much for spending this time with me, giving me a healthy education on Hugh Steers.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you again for having me. Any opportunity to talk about Hugh makes me very happy. So thank you very much.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.